Good afternoon. This is Anthony Fasano from the Engineering Management Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to today's session, Developing Effective Communication Skills for Engineering Managers. We are, of course, excited to be delivering this multi-level career development webinar series in conjunction with the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. And for this management experience level, this is the second session that we've given, and we have two more to go. The next one will be on productivity, and then one more that will be kind of an open Q&A. And if you missed the first one on leadership and engaging with people, we'll give you a URL where you'll be able to access that and register for future sessions as well. So what I'd like to do just to get started here is, and I'll introduce myself in a moment, but first I want to give a quote to start us off for today. It's a quote from Brian Tracy, the author and professional development expert. Communication is a skill that you can learn. It's like riding a bicycle or typing. If you're willing to work at it, you can rapidly improve the quality of every part of your life. Now, the reason that I start with this quote for this session is because as engineers, and I'm an engineer myself, or technical professionals in general, there's a misnomer out there that we can't communicate effectively, we can't speak effectively, and many engineers don't like speaking in public or getting up in front of people. And part of the reason is because I think we can't do it, right? We're not born with it. It's not natural for us. Well, the point of this quote is to drive home the point that you can learn these skills, just like you can learn to ride a bike. When I started transitioning from an engineer to a trainer and a speaker, I never thought I'd be able to get up in front of people, and I was awful at doing so. But since then, I've spoken in front of thousands and thousands of engineers, all because of practice and improving these skills. So the first thing I want you to do is just know that all of the skills we're going to cover today, you can improve them, regardless of whether you think you can or you can't. But of course, we want to help you to believe that. Now, a quick intro on myself for those of you that didn't make the first session that we held. I am a licensed professional engineer. I have a bachelor's and master's in engineering, and I practiced as an engineer. And when I was practicing as a young engineer, I decided that I wanted to be a leader in my firm. And so in order to get to that point, I looked at the other leaders in my firm, and something stuck out at me. And what that was that in addition to all their technical skills, these leaders had sound interpersonal skills. They could communicate effectively. They could network and build relationships with other people. They knew how to delegate and make sure the team was productive. And so I worked hard at developing all those skills. And my career took off because of that. And one day my boss approached me and said, Anthony, we love what you're doing. We'd like you to go around to our other offices and provide this training to our engineers. And so at first I said, no, I'm an engineer. I'm not a trainer. I can't do that. However, I convinced myself to go for it, and basically two things happened. I went to these offices, did the training, and number one, I loved it. But number two, and really more importantly at the time, the company started seeing results, better project performance, better team communication, better vendor and client communication. And so at that point, I decided that I wanted to do more coaching and training. I enrolled in executive coaching school. I started Toastmasters to learn how to speak in public, and I built an internal coaching and training program for the company. And eventually I realized that if there's this many engineers that need help with these skills, there are a lot more out there. And back in 2009, I left and started building the Engineering Management Institute and providing these coaching and training services all over the country, which is how I eventually hooked up with ASME, and I'm here through this series to help you. Now, the purpose and learning objectives of this specific session is to help you to learn practical strategies that can be used on a daily basis to incrementally improve your communication skills and subsequently your ability to communicate with others. In this session, you will learn how to communicate effectively with team members, say things in a way that will help you get the responses you are seeking, listen more effectively, in my opinion, the key to communication, be responsive so people want to communicate with you, and apply strategies to effectively collaborate with your team members. Now, a couple of other important housekeeping items. The URL you see on the bottom of the screen there is the URL that will take you to information about this career development series, including the next sessions that you can register for from that page, go.asme.org/career-webinars. Secondly, and very importantly, you will have access and you can gain access to these slides that you're about to see today, as well as the recording of this session. To do that, we're going to be sending you an evaluation immediately after this session. It will take you 2 minutes to fill it out, give us some feedback, and indicate at the end of the evaluation, yes, you would like the slides and recording, and give us a few days, 3 or 4 days, and we will email you both of those items. A real tactical overview for today is we'll talk about some fundamentals of effective communication, but then transition into collaboration. Collaboration is a big part of an engineer's job, quite frankly, because we're constantly working with other people. So we'll give you some specific strategies to effectively collaborate on your projects. Now, the first thing that I want to do to get into effective communication fundamentals is I want to ask you a question. And I want to keep it simple, just to warm you up a little bit here. I'd like to ask you to type in one word that comes to mind when I say effective communication. I'm going to stop here for a minute and let you type in one word. I'm going to shut my cam off too so we can focus on the slides now. But I'd like you to type in one word that when I say effective communication, the first word that pops into your head. And don't overthink it. Just, the first word that comes to mind. All right, let's see what we got here. We got some answers here. I'm going to read through these. Listening. Wow, I'm shocked that was first. Great. Listening, understanding, clear, active listening, clarity, listen, clear, mutual, listening, clarity, clear, 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 listening, listening, brief, listening. All right, a lot of the same ones, which is good. Honesty, concise. Where do we type these words? Apparently right where you were typing them. Vocabulary. All right, excellent. Those are good, and we're gonna lean on some of those words and phrases as we go through the session here today. Now, the first thing that I want to remind you when it comes to effective communication, whether it's on projects, it doesn't matter. It could be at home, right? Just effective communication in general has to happen from start to finish, whether it is a project, whether it is a conversation, whether it is a situation that you're dealing with over a number of weeks, right? What I see happen often is at the beginning of a project, people will get together and lay things out very well, but then they don't keep that intensity in terms of communication throughout the project, and that's when things go off the tracks. So you need to communicate consistently from start to finish on the projects that you're working on or with the teams that you're working on. Now, one of the things that I want to highlight here at the beginning of this session is there are so many different forms of communication in the world that we live in today, right? Text messages, email, web applications, a phone call. I mention that because as engineers, and especially as managers, it is your responsibility to understand what form of communication that you need to utilize in every situation. So, if you're working with a vendor on a project, doing a design, and you need information from that vendor to complete your design process, and this is a vendor that's constantly on the road, and you're emailing the vendor for the information, and he or she is not answering emails. They're on the road traveling. Instead, you should have picked up the phone or texted them a message. Then what's going to happen is you may be late on your design, and that's ultimately your fault, not the vendor's fault. Because as an engineer, as a manager, as someone overseeing projects, you need to know what form of communication that you need to use. And for those of you that are managers that are managing people at different experience levels, they also may use different forms of communication, right? Younger individuals may lean more on technology, or more experienced engineers might be leaning more on methods like a phone call or an in-person meeting. So this is something that is not the same as it used to be, because there are now more forms of communication that you have to manage, but it's certainly a part of your job as a manager. So that's something that you need to think about. Now, the other thing that I want to mention around this in terms of project communication is the one thing about all these different channels of communication and all these different technologies is there's a lot of advantages to that, because it's easier to get in touch with people, right? There's so many ways to do it. However, there are also some negatives to that. The negatives are that there are more channels for you to have to manage as an engineer, which just becomes more difficult. So what I recommend that you do with your teams when you start a project, a design project, any kind of project that you're working on, you should create a set of standards or a communication workflow from the beginning of the project to facilitate this start to finish communication. So, for example, that might be one individual that's responsible for all of the vendor correspondence, one person that's responsible for all of the technical changes, one person that's responsible for running the project meetings every week and putting together meeting minutes with action items. And then follow that process, because if you don't have a clear communication workflow in place, you might have problems, right? You might have someone who made a phone call to a manufacturer about something that someone else already talked to them about, or someone else now gives them different information on. So you need to make sure that everybody's on the same team in any type of project you're running, which is a critical component to effective communication or avoiding breakdown in communication. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is we've been talking about technology and different ways to communicate online. Well, nonverbal communication strategies are also extremely important, especially as a manager when you're communicating with your staff in the office on a regular basis. Most people don't realize that the way that they say something is just as important as what they're actually saying. So let me walk through a couple of different types of nonverbal communication or different types of body language that you need to be aware of in your communication efforts. Your body movements and your posture are one of them. Consider how your perceptions of people are affected by the way they sit, walk, stand, look at you. The way that you move and you carry yourself communicate a wealth of information to the people around you. Again, your posture, your bearing, your stance, these little subtle movements, they all matter. Another one is gestures. We gesture all day long. We wave, we point. We use our hands when we're arguing or speaking in an animated fashion. Expressing ourselves with gestures is something we do without even thinking. However, it sends a message to people. What message does it send? And for those of you, I'm sure that all of you on this call are not in the same country, right? Gestures can be different across different cultures and different regions. So be careful to avoid misinterpretation. Another one is eye contact. Since the visual sense is dominant for most people, eye contact is an especially important type of nonverbal communication. The way that you look at someone can communicate many things to them, including interest, hostility, anger. Eye contact is also important in maintaining the flow of a conversation and also for gauging the other person's interest and their response. And it's too easy in today's world with all the distractions and mobile phones to break eye contact when you really shouldn't, and then you lose that engagement. Touch is another deal through touch. Think about the messages given by a handshake. If you were to walk up to someone and go into a meeting with a firm handshake, that shows confidence right off the bat. If it's a weak handshake, it may show lack of confidence or weakness. Space is another one. Have you ever felt uncomfortable during a conversation because the other person was standing too close to you or invading your space? I laugh because I think about the Seinfeld episodes, if any of you have seen that one with the close talker. Right? We all have this need for physical space. Now, the need may differ depending on the culture or the situation. However, physical space can be used to communicate things, aggression, dominance, etc. And the last one that I'll touch on is voice. Again, it's not just what you say, it's how you say it. When we speak, other people read our voices in addition to listening to our words. Things that they might pay attention to might include the timing and pace of your voice, how loud you speak, your tone and inflection, and sounds that might convey understanding, as if you were to say to someone, oh, okay, all right, I get it. I mean, just think about how the tone of someone's voice, for example, might indicate sarcasm or anger or affection or confidence. The bottom line here is that the way you look, listen, move, and react to other people tells them more about how you're feeling than words alone ever can. So those nonverbal actions can really, really have an impact on your communication efforts. All right, so here's a question that came in here that might be a good place to take this now. What are your best practices for handling quote-unquote tone in electronic communications where people don't have visual or oral references to each other's body language or voice? Excellent question. So here's the thing about that. The thing about that is you're not really going to necessarily pick up tone in an email depending on the way the email is written. However, the nice thing about email versus a live conversation is you can reread your email multiple times before you send it, whereas in a conversation, you respond and then that's the way you respond, right? So if you get an email and you're angry at somebody, you can write a very angry email back to them, but then not send it, cool off for 10 minutes, and then reread it and rewrite it in a better way that will help you achieve your goal in that conversation. So in terms of tone in an actual email, there are some things that you can do, like you could use capital letters for a word, to highlight something, to bold it, to almost make it like you're raising your tone of voice. Like this is a very important part of the design, and then go into what it is. You could underline things. Sometimes I'll use 2 arrows to highlight something. You might lead, if you have a longer email to write, you might lead with a summary. Some people will call it bluff, bottom line up front. Give them the bottom line up front in the email so that if they don't get through the entire thing, they know ultimately what you were emailing them about. So there's some different things you can do with email to highlight things or add some tone to them, even though it's not really that, again, that audio tone. But again, the best thing about email is that you have the time to review it. So thank you for the question. Good one. The next point I want to talk about here is just the overall having good manners, kind of being courteous in your communication efforts. Again, it's kind of a simple thing, but it means a lot. Having good manners, being courteous does increase your likability, helps you to earn respect, and really can just help you to get what you want, quite frankly. And I'm going to give you a very specific example of this because I've been exposed to a few of them in the workplace. Let's say that I'm working as an engineer. I'm working on a project. And I'm sitting at my desk and my supervisor comes up to me and says, Anthony, you're staying here as late as it takes tonight to get these plans done. We have a meeting with the vendor tomorrow morning, and we need to take them through all these specifications. They need to be done correctly, and they need to be finished tonight. And they walk away. Now, first thing first, Am I going to stay and get it done? You bet I am, right? It's my job. I have to get it done. We got a big meeting in the morning. Now, am I going to be happy with my supervisor, or is that conversation I just had cultivating a long-term positive relationship with my supervisor? The answer to that question is probably not. Now, if my supervisor would have came up to me and said, Anthony, you're doing a great job on this project. I really need you to stay as late as it's going to take tonight to get these specifications done. The vendor's coming in first thing in the morning, and we need to walk them through these specifications and make sure that they're ready for them to take them and go with it. Are you okay with that? Now, again, am I going to stay and get it done? Of course I'm going to stay and get it done, right? My boss asked me to do it. However, that conversation is cultivating a much more positive relationship between my boss and myself in the moment, and also for sure long term. And all it took was that boss or supervisor saying something a little bit differently than they said it, with the same real meaning at the end of the day. So just think about the way that you're phrasing things, the way that you're delivering things to people, the tone you're using, and the way that you're pitching it to them. It could mean all the difference in the response you get from people, the relationships you're building, and the quality of your conversations. We had another question come in here from Colin. How many forms of communication do you permit across a project? Do you limit the types ever? Or is it purely based on the project stakeholders' preference? That's a great question. So first of all, the project stakeholders' preference certainly needs to play a role in the type of communication that you use on a project. If your stakeholder, client, vendor, however you want to refer to them, the outside party, if they prefer to email, then you're going to probably be emailing with them. Now, that being said, your internal communication doesn't have to be email. So what we do here at EMI on our projects is we use an internal messaging system known as Slack. You may have heard of it. It's very popular. What that allowed us to do is completely eliminate emails that would include only team members here. There's no reason for us to send any inter-office emails because everything gets done over Slack. Now, if we're working with a client, of course, and I'm emailing a client and I need to copy a team member here, there will be email between us. So my recommendation was I don't really limit the types or the number of avenues of communication, although you just need to think about the best ones for each project, because you do not want to have too many. And it may be as simple as, you use a messaging, and I'm making this up, but you use a messaging software for internal communication, use email externally with clients, and if you get to a certain point or there's something that comes up, then you go to a phone call or something along those lines. And that's all part of that communication workflow that I recommend you establish at the beginning of a specific project. Hope that's helpful, Colin. All right, so next I want to talk about listening. Here's a quote on the screen from Ernest Hemingway. When people talk, listen completely. Most people never listen. And I can tell you right now that my wife will agree with that quote 100%, because sometimes, and my wife's also an engineer, by the way, but sometimes at night I'm sitting on the couch, she's talking to me, and I am on another planet. I don't know why. It was a long day. Maybe something TV's on in the background, or maybe kids running around in the background, and I'm not listening completely to her. And at some point in time, she'll say, "Are you listening to me?" And a lot of times I have to say, "You know what? I'm sorry, I'm not. I got distracted." And I was very happy that when I asked you early on how you would describe communication, many of you said listening. And I can be honest with you, when I give this session, often not one person says listening. People say talking, speaking, emailing, all the forms of kind of you talking or giving information to someone else. However, what I'm here to tell you, in my opinion, is that listening is communicating, right? Communicating has to be a two-way street. One way is people talking, the other way is people listening, because if no one's listening, then it's not communication. And so I want to dive into this a little bit more. And one of the things that I try to do with all of our training at the Engineering Management Institute, every session that we give is, yes, I want to highlight these important strategies and skills, but I also want to give you real actionable ways that you can improve. So how can you, if listening is so important, how can you leave this session today and get better at it? Very simple. I'm going to give you 2 strategies right now for doing that, okay? Now, here's a challenge that we deal with in the engineering world that makes these strategies you see on the screen so important. I coach many engineering managers. Companies call me up and say, we got a manager, we're having trouble with this manager, they're high potential, we need you to help them. So the first thing that I do is I sit down with their team that they manage, maybe individually, and I ask them questions. And one of the questions is always, what is the biggest challenge that you find for your manager? Or what is one thing that you really wish that your manager would improve on? And I cannot tell you how many times I hear the same thing, which is, my manager cuts me off all the time, never lets me finish my sentences, never lets me get my thoughts out. Can you imagine that that's what I hear all the time? I'm thinking I'm going to hear something like maybe they're mean, maybe they don't communicate effectively, maybe they're not clear in giving us goals or giving us expectations, but I hear they cut me off all the time. So after hearing that so many times, I tried to really think through this. And I think that one of the reasons that this happens is because we as engineers are programmed by schooling to solve problems. So if you and I are in a conversation and you give me any small type of a problem, any challenge, any problem, something that's not working, my brain immediately goes to solving it, and I immediately want to spit out answers because I want to help you. I want to solve your problem. Now, the problem with that is that it's not a good thing when you cut someone off. I used to do this thinking that I was helping people when I finished their sentences. But in fact, research has shown that you're disempowering them. And by cutting off someone's sentences or talking over them, what you're essentially saying to them, more or less, is that I don't care what you're saying. What I'm saying is way more important. And so here are 2 things that you can do to improve your listening and avoid this dangerous action of cutting people off or not listening fully to people. Number 1 is to listen for silence. Very simple. Well, simple but not easy. When you're in a conversation, you're talking with someone or multiple people. After someone finishes talking and before you start talking, I want you to listen for just 1 second, a half a second of complete silence. By forcing yourself to listen for silence, you will never cut anybody off because you have to hear the silence first before you speak. The first time you try to do this, I guarantee you won't be able to do it. And it's not your fault. You've just built up other habits. After focusing on it for a couple of weeks, you will be able to do it, and you will drastically improve the quality of your conversation. Now, the second thing you can do to help you in terms of listening is to acknowledge people. And all that is simply repeating some of the words that people say back to you in a conversation. And what this does is it cements in these people's minds that you are truly listening to them. And at the subconscious level, it makes them feel good about that and connected with you. So for example, if I have a stakeholder that calls me up and says, Anthony, you have to get this project done on time. It's a super important project for us with a very sensitive timeline. I might say to that person, listen, Peter, we know this is a super important project for you with a tight timeline, and we got our best engineers working on it, and we are going to hit that timeline for you. I'm reinforcing to that individual that I heard what they're saying, and I'm sensitive to that, and because of that, you're going to build a better rapport with that person. Next, I want to talk about responsiveness. Very important aspect of communication in today's world. Why? Because Everybody in today's world wants answers immediately. Think about it. How do you feel when you send someone a message and they don't respond? I mean, we're at a point right now where you could text someone, and if they don't get back to you within 2 minutes, you're like, what's going on here? I don't understand what happened. It's 2 minutes and they haven't gotten back to me yet. However, here's something that's important for you to know. People just want to know that you've heard them. That's the most important thing. You don't necessarily have to get back to them with a whole bunch of answers. So to give you an example of this, what if someone called me up, a client called me up, and I missed their phone call, but they left me a voicemail. And they said, Anthony, we worked on XYZ project with you a few years ago, and the project was stopped, and now we want to start the project up again. So can you please take out all of the files associated with that project so we can come in and review them with you? Now, I have a decision to make here. There's one of two things that I can do. The first thing I can do is I can call them back immediately and say, Mary, I got your message. I'm excited the project's going to start up again. It's going to take us about 2 days to pull out all the old files. I will do that, get in touch with you, and we could sit down together. Or I can say to myself, it's going to take me 2 days to get those files out. We'll get them out, and then I'll call Mary back. Now, I would always opt for the first option, which is to call them back immediately. Why? Because then they know they've been heard, and they don't have to wait 2 days wondering if you got the message and feeling uneasy about things. One thing about responsiveness is it does impact your reputation and your credibility. People rate you on that. So it's imperative to really get back to someone in a reasonable amount of time, even if you don't have an answer. I know it doesn't feel right sometimes, but it's better than not getting back to them at all. We used to have, the engineering company that I used to work for, we used to have companies hire us because of how responsive they heard that we were, and their engineers were not as responsive to them. And what my CEO at the time always used to preach to our engineering group was, if you don't respond in a timely manner, next time they might not be calling you. So that's something I want all of you to think about in your responsiveness or your efforts to be responsive. The other thing that's an important part of communication is earning the trust and respect of the people that you communicate with on a regular basis, right? People want to communicate with people they trust and respect. They build up a rapport, and it's easier to make that connection. And that goes back to what I talked about earlier. If you're being condescending to people, if you're not courteous, do you think they're going to trust and respect you? No, they're not. Some other things that you can do is when you speak to people, if you're assigning a task to an engineer with less experience than you, the way you assign it can help with this. You can say something like, you've done a wonderful job on this project so far, so I'm going to challenge you and give you something that you haven't done before. That little exchange right there earns you an amazing amount of trust and respect. And that helps you not only to communicate better with the individual, but also to be a better leader. The other thing you can do to earn trust and respect is to lead by example. If you've set up this workflow for project communication where John on your team is going to be the client correspondent, and you go and start corresponding with the client without telling the group, you're not leading by example. And that is not going to end well for you. All right, now we're going to transition into project team kind of communication and collaboration. Collaboration is the key here. Collaboration really is, working with many groups at the same time. A couple of points about this. First of all, what I want to say here in terms of collaboration and working with others is it's always better to communicate early and often in projects. Anytime you wait in a collaborative group, if you hold back important information to later in a project or later in time, it becomes more difficult to get people on the same page, right? So communicate early and often, as we said earlier, in terms of starting the project, but also it's important to get buy-in when you're collaborating with other parties. So if you're working with another division in your company, you might want to go to them and say, we're going to be working on this project together. We're pulling some resources from past projects. We'd love for you to give some input and advice that you might have up front based on your past experiences. Now, right off the bat, they're saying, man, we're looking forward to working with these people. They're already asking for our advice and our input and our feedback before we even get started. You're setting up that very collaborative atmosphere. And again, what that's going to lead to is better results, better collaboration, which has so many positive benefits to it, like blending complementary strengths, building up synergy, avoiding duplication of work now because you have multiple people cranking on different things. So all that being said, again, I want to put this into frameworks you can use. So I want to dive into these 10 strategies to effective project communication. Now, real quick, we had a point here. Good point, Anthony. The response with timely matter is one of the major factors driving the earning of trust and respect. Yeah, that's a good point, right? If you want to earn trust and respect and you don't respond to people in a timely manner, you're certainly not going to build up trust and respect. So thank you for reinforcing that. I appreciate that. All right, so I'm going to run through these 10 strategies to collaboration here. And we have quite a few of you on the call, so what we'll do is think up some questions that you might have on these, and then at the end, we should have some time left that we could field some of those questions. And if we can't get to them, that's why we've designed an entire call at the end of these sessions just for Q&A. First strategy for effective collaboration, you've got to know your team members and your client, your stakeholder, your vendor, the manufacturer, the other parties you're working with. If you don't know them, you can't manage them or manage the project effectively and communicate effectively. So in terms of your team, that might mean getting together with your team and going to lunch one day, once a month, once a week, one evening after work, getting together with your team in a social setting. Allows you to build that rapport and that bond that you need to get to know people to help the team to collaborate more effectively. It can't just sometimes be about a couple of interactions on a project. Number 2, if you're running a project, conduct an effective kickoff meeting. I mentioned this earlier without going into really the specifics of this. So what do I mean by that? Okay, you're starting a new project. There's multiple parties involved that are going to collaborate. What are some of the things you might need to do to create an effective kickoff meeting or start to a project? You might want to review and understand the scope of work of the project, the schedule, the budget, the timeline. I don't know how effectively you can collaborate if not everybody understands these things. You might want to define clear project roles and responsibilities and communicate expectations. I would say that that is pretty important to a project. You're going to want to set regular team meetings and build them into the project schedule. You can't just wing it and say, we'll catch up and we'll go over this in a week or so. No, every Monday at this time, we're having a project meeting. As I mentioned earlier, establish and document a communication plan for the project. Have a process in place so when there are changes to the project, you can make changes, adjust documents, adjust files, and then make them available to people through whatever outlets you utilize, whatever technological outlets or online sharing units that you're using. Foster open and safe communication culture within your team. At the beginning of the project, you should tell someone, maybe it's a young engineer that's new and not very confident, say, listen, you're part of this project team. If you have an issue with something, you have to bring it to us. We understand that you're young. You might have questions. You might not be aware of a technical guideline, component, or material that you need. Come and ask us. We want the project to succeed, and you're a member of this team. So you need to feel comfortable in voicing those opinions or those questions. You need to set that up from the beginning of the work on your projects. Here's a question that came in before I go to the next strategy from Tyler. How do you recommend knowing your team members when they are across the country or the world? Excellent question. And, there's only so much you can do in this situation. You obviously can't go out to lunch with them. However, what you could try to do from time to time, Tyler, is maybe do some of your project meetings by video conference and get to know them in that way, where you're seeing them, you're connecting with them. From time to time, I know it can't be on a regular basis, but if there's any kind of company or industry conference where they're going to be going and it could serve you as well, attend, get to meet in person, even if it's once a year. Try to make it a point to do that. If there's a project site that you're working on and you can arrange for a meeting at that site, it will benefit the project overall, the stakeholders involved, and your relationships with those other team members. So luckily, technology has made some ways that we can still get to know people, get to see people when we're not with them, but you still need to put in the time and effort to go ahead and do that. Thank you, Tyler, for reminding us that it's not always easy because people span different continents. Okay, the next strategy, communicate with the client or stakeholder early on at the beginning of the project if anything is unclear in the scope of work or schedule. This is a huge challenge in the engineering world. I talk to teams all the time that end up spending hours of work on a design project or a portion of an engineering design only to go back to their stakeholder, the client, the manufacturer, their boss, and they say, why did you do that? We wanted to design it the other way, or we wanted to use the other material, or the architect, or the electrical engineer, or the other discipline is already doing this. Didn't you clarify that or clear that at the beginning of the project? Apparently not. And this happens if you don't run through that kickoff procedure like I talked about earlier. So make sure that you have everything you need, and if there's any technical or design decisions that you're going to need to make, have the information that you need to make them when you arrive at those decisions. Number 4, include every person on the team. And I'll qualify this by saying, include them where they need to be included. We don't want to have over redundancy in terms of the communication efforts and the people that are involved in meetings and things of that nature. However, it's a delicate balance because at the same time, there are things that everyone on the team needs to know. So part of what we talked about earlier with designing your communication workflow is think about everybody involved on the project and how important it is for each of them to have those pieces of information. Because if you do leave someone out, bad things can happen, number one, to the project, and also people may be discouraged, younger people, like, why wasn't I in on this decision at all? And if they weren't supposed to be, explain it to them, but just be aware of it. Be open and transparent, just as a manager in general. Forget from a project perspective for a minute. As a manager in general, I talk to a lot of engineers, and they tell me that the best managers they've had are totally open. They can go and talk to them about their careers, talk to them about their projects, talk to them about a challenging situation they're facing, and be totally comfortable with it. So as a manager, as a team leader, be open and transparent and let people know that you're there to help them in the project, but then also beyond that. You have to hold effective meetings to have any kind of good collaboration. So in my opinion, an effective meeting is one that is short, to the point, and productive. And this, what I'm about to show you, may not necessarily apply on a project meeting, for example, but when we do our staff meetings at EMI, I ask everyone to give some good news at the beginning to get our meeting off on the right foot. We go through some key performance indicators, and we look at some of the kind of our scorecard over the last week and how things are progressing. We do a scope review of some of the items the big items that we want to touch on. Are there any customer and employee headlines we need to touch on? We have a to-do list on our weekly agenda that gets filled with action items with the person's initials next to them throughout the meeting. So what we do here at the beginning of the meeting is we go through the to-do list from last week and see if items were done and they can come off or they have to remain on. And then we have an issues list. And an issues list are major issues or items that we want to work through on that call. And if something goes off on a tangent in some way, shape, or form and becomes a whole nother discussion, we will table that to the bottom of the issues list and try to address it at the end of the meeting or have its own meeting for that topic so it doesn't blow up the entire meeting. So again, this is our process. You have to come up with your own because we have 100 people on this call and they're all going to have different types of projects and teams, but just have an agenda that works best for your team and follow it. Here's another one that could really help in terms of collaboration on projects is providing progress reports to your team, to your client, to your stakeholder, to the end user on a regular basis. When I was practicing as an engineer, on some of our bigger projects, I would do a weekly email to our client with all of the project updates as of that time. So they knew that at least every week at a minimum they were getting an email update, and they were very happy about that. Again, it puts people at ease. They don't have to worry because they know they're going to get updated at least on a weekly basis. And it will only take you a few minutes to do that. And quite frankly, by reflecting on things to write this progress report, you may find some things or uncover some things that need to be addressed. Here's another big one. Taking responsibility for mistakes, but giving praise to the team for success. This is something that many leaders don't do, and it can really break down your collaboration efforts. Nobody wants to collaborate or work with a leader who takes all of the praise and doesn't share with the team. And nobody wants to work with a leader when things go wrong, they blame their team. So remember that because it will have a huge impact on your ability to build collaboration, build good collaboration with others, including your specifically your staff. Provide team members feedback in person if possible, or at least on the phone. I really like how you're doing XYZ. I'd like to see you do more of this. Or, I see your strengths being in this field. Maybe you want to cut back on some of these other items so you could accentuate your strengths. I would really focus on what's happening now, even including things that they should be doing at the same level. You're doing a really good job at this. I would keep this up just as you're doing it. But if you're not giving your team feedback on a regular basis, how can they improve? Or if you're giving them feedback on what they're doing right, again, will inspire them to do better. So constantly have that feedback loop open with your staff, with your team. Last but certainly not least, in terms of collaboration, you must celebrate success with the project team and reward collaboration. We live in a world as engineers where we go from one project to the next often, or you work on a very big project that has many components, and you have your head down and your foot on the gas pedal, and there's never any reprieve. And it's a dangerous way to work. I like to refer to it as a hamster wheel. Every once in a while, we got to step off the hamster wheel. We've got to recognize that we had a big win in our career, a big win for our stakeholder, a big win finishing the project for our company, and we need to celebrate that with our team and recognize what worked. And doing that can promote great relationships on your team, and avoiding to do this or not doing this can really lead to burnout, because then you start to lose purpose in why you're working towards things, and you just become a machine. In summary, we talked about some effective communication fundamentals. One of them on the project is to stay consistent with your communication efforts throughout. We talked about the importance of collaboration and specifically walk through these 10 strategies that you can help or use to help you hopefully in your team, or at least pick one or two of them and help to use them. What I'd like to do right now before we go into a Q&A here is, what's one takeaway from this session that you are going to try to apply immediately? I'd love for you to type those in so I can just get a feel for that, what resonated with you. All right, we got a bunch coming in here. Let's see. Wait for silence. Reward collaboration. Listen for silence. Listen for silence. Listen for silence. Listen for silence. More proactive communication. Focus on listening. Responsiveness. Weekly updates. I like that one. Body language. Responding immediately, even without an answer. Communication plan at the beginning of the project. Feedback. Eye contact. Waiting for silence. A lot of the same ones here. I might not read them all here, but really good. Thank you for all these. It sounds like the listening one was a big takeaway. Now, do you have any questions? And while you're thinking about that, I want to remind you of just a few things. Again, our website at engineeringmanagementinstitute.org is absolutely loaded with free professional development resources, including past podcast episodes and video. And ASME is giving you access to these live webinar sessions at go.asme.org/career-webinars, where you can get access to other webinars like this one that are coming up. Our next one will be on productivity for this experience level. And lastly, I want to remind you that if you haven't already, within a few minutes, you're going to receive an email from us at EMI with a short evaluation for this session. Please, I'd love your feedback. It helps us to improve the program. And just indicate in that evaluation, yes, I would like the slides and I would like the recording, and we'll get them out to you in the next few days. Here's a question that came in here from Colin. How much time do you carve out during projects for communication? Great question, Colin. I would say that think about the big fundamental communication drivers in your projects, which would be usually staff or team meetings, client meetings, maybe site visits, and start with those as your time blocks and then work around them. A lot of times your communication will be variable because it depends kind of on what problems you encounter or challenges that come up. What I like to do, though, is I just plan for what I can plan for, and I plan for having regular meetings. I plan for maybe doing weekly progress reports, and build around those types of cornerstone communication efforts on your projects. That would be my recommendation there. Any other questions before we wrap up today's session? All right, everybody, we'll look for the email with the evaluation. We'll get the recording and slides out to you, and please go to the URL you see on the screen there to register for the next session. And until next time, I hope that everything you learned in this session will help you. Oh, one more question. Go ahead, fire away. We've got a few minutes here. When presenting training, or I guess when presenting or providing training, I'm not seeing the rest of the question here. Maybe it's coming through here in a moment. When presenting training, what is the most effective way you have found to elicit feedback from a group? Just ask for it. I mean, just to be straightforward. I mean, first of all, I would tell them at the beginning of the session, like I told you today, I'm going to want your feedback on this session because I do want to continuously improve it, and then get that feedback. If you could do it in an evaluation, that's helpful because then you can collect data from different people, different perspectives, and then see what the feedback is and then apply it, essentially. That's what I would recommend there. How to deal with a colleague that's hiding information to himself? I mean, you're going to get people like that. You have to just take it on as it comes and have a conversation with them, let them know that you're aware of what they're doing and it's not a good practice, and challenge them to change. And if they don't change, then I don't know what your authority is there, but you'll have to make some decisions or talk to someone who can make some decisions. All right, with that, thank you everyone for your time here today. I appreciate it, and I hope that you can use the information in today's session to engineer your own success.